horror has a face, and you must make a friend of horror. Horror and moral terror are your friends. If they are not, then they are enemies to be feared. They are truly enemies.
In a movie chock full of memorable lines, this may just be the most profound and chilling of them all. Apocalypse Now is the greatest war film of all time in my humble opinion, and this movie covers a wide variety of topics ranging from the glorification of war to the vilification of those who dare to think for themselves. However, the main area of Apocalypse Now that I will be focusing on for this video is the psyche needed to be a soldier. This brings us back to the opening quote of this video. It's in this moment where Walter Kurtz, a seemingly insane colonel who has gone rogue, lays down to Benjamin Willard his realization and lessons from witnessing the most brutal acts that eyes can see. Kurtz talks about soldiers who went into a village which had accepted vaccines from the opposing army. He then details how these soldiers chopped off each vaccinated arm as a lesson to those who dared to accept the enemy's generosity. However, what Kurtz is more fixated on than the villagers is the soldiers themselves. These men who found it within themselves to chop the arms off women and children. He remarks that these soldiers were not sociopaths or men devoid of humanity. In fact, he says quite the opposite. These men were moral, they had families, and hearts filled with love. Yet when the time came, they had the strength to put all of that away and to do what they deemed necessary. It's this ability here to distance yourself from what you deem to be moral, to do what you consider necessary, that Kurtz considers admirable and a display of true strength. Kurtz talks extensively about moral terror and how you need to understand the brutality of war, become friends with it, and use it to your advantage. Because if you don't, then those you are fighting against will use it against you. This aspect of utilizing moral terror and going against your own feelings to do what you deem to be necessary is a crucial element of being a soldier. It's this mentality that Oppenheimer seems unable to embrace, and this makes sense since he's not a soldier, but rather a scientist. Even when he dons the uniform and tries to take on a more militaristic approach to the Manhattan Project, he is immediately rebuked by his friend and colleague Isidore. Oppenheimer is told by his friend that the uniform doesn't fit him and that they both know he'll never be able to truly be a part of the military since it's not in his nature. This seems to be a precursor to how Oppenheimer will always have his differences with the military, and that no matter how hard he tries, he'll never be able to embrace the soldier mentality. Oppenheimer can't take on this mentality because he fails at doing the things that Kurtz adamantly praises. Kurtz finds a special kind of beauty in men who are able to distance themselves from their morals and their personal judgments. In fact, Kurtz literally says,
"Because it's judgment that defeats us."
Kurtz openly accepts that disgusting things happen in war, but he makes it clear that a soldier must not dwell on their actions since they are doing what their leaders have deemed necessary. You must accept what you're doing as a necessary evil, and even if it surpasses your judgment, you should not let that hinder you, because it's not your job to judge. If you stop to think about your actions and the brutality of your situation, then you're only hurting yourself, and this is displayed very clearly in Apocalypse Now. Although Kurtz tries to remain stoic, it's very obvious that his participation in such horrors haunts him, and this is why his last words are, It's an acknowledgement of his sin, and how what he has inflicted on others has come back to him. On the other hand, the film also shows us the polar opposite of Kurtz, with Lieutenant Kilgore. Kilgore is a man who is able to seemingly relish in war. He finds the joy within the chaos, and he does this by distracting himself with other objectives that blind himself from what he's really doing. He isn't thinking about the village he's raiding. Rather, his mind is fixated on finding a good spot to surf. He seems to be thinking about war as more of a hangout with his boys than an event centered around tragedy. Kilgore would rather acknowledge the dead as a playing card than as a corpse. And instead of thinking about the damage his military's weapons are causing, he savors the smell.
I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
He isn't a brutal man, though, or a psychopath devoid of morals. He has moments of humanity amidst the sheer carnage, and this ties back to Kurtz, praising the moral men who can separate their values from their actions. Kilgore has made a friend of horror and moral terror. He seems enthusiastic to use his arsenal of weapons, and he glorifies the aftermath. He's able to do this by distancing himself from what he's doing, since he's not there to be a judge. He's just there to be an enforcer, to do the job that his leaders have deemed necessary. He also encourages his unit to cheer up, and he knows that if they don't accept their actions as part of their role, then they won't be able to psychologically survive the war. Out of these two perspectives on war, it's quite obvious where Oppenheimer stands. He is unable to distance himself from the outcomes of his creations, and he feels the need to judge his actions. Oppenheimer does the exact thing Kurtz warns against, and he defeats himself with his own judgment. When Oppenheimer talks to President Truman, he mentions how he feels blood on his hands. Truman then tells him that the only one responsible is the person who chose to use the bombs, and he calls Oppenheimer a crybaby. Truman's reaction to Oppenheimer may seem harsh, but given his background, you can understand his perspective. Truman was a soldier himself. He served in World War I, and so he has become accustomed to the soldier mentality. Oppenheimer, who has the mindset of a scientist and feels the need to look more critically at his actions, is a far cry from the stoic and unflinching Truman. While Oppenheimer and Kurtz are fundamentally different characters, they both display the fact that you can't escape from the atrocities you commit. While Kurtz embraces the horror, he can't help but acknowledge his wrongdoings, and this is evident by his last words. Oppenheimer also tries to embrace the horror, and we see this with his speech during the bleacher scene, when he remarks that he wishes they could have used the same weapons on the Germans. But ultimately, Oppenheimer can't escape from his participation in such an atrocity either. I believe there is truth to the quote, "You must make a friend of horror in the context of war." And many of the most successful empires relied on fear-mongering tactics to yield the best results. But Kurtz and Oppenheimer show that embracing such a mentality creates a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. If you embrace the horror like Kurtz, then it will come back to bite you in the rear, as your conscience slowly chips away at your sanity. And if you acknowledge it for the evil that it is like Oppenheimer, then you'll be consumed by the immense guilt that comes from your involvement with such cruelty. It seems that the only option you have to deal with the horror is to accept the role of an enforcer, but to reject that of a judge. You must utilize the horror, but at the same time, distract yourself from it ethically. We see this with Kilgore, and even with the US after the atomic bombs, that tried to cover up its method of winning with the victory itself. The US also tried to suppress information pertaining to the radioactivity of these bombs after they were initially used. Kilgore reminiscing about a hill being torched with napalm fits in too well here.
I love the smell of napalm in the morning. You know, one time we had a hail bomb? For 12 hours, when it was all over, I walked up. We didn't find one of them, not one stinking dink body. The smell, you know that gasoline smell? The whole hill. It smelled like victory.
His words show that he was willing to look past the horror of men being incinerated to focus on the smell of victory. Without a doubt, the same smell that lingered in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.